Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're taking you back to the 14th century, to the time of one of the most horrifying pandemics in history, the Black Death. This was a disease so deadly and mysterious that it struck fear into the hearts of millions, reshaping society and leaving a dark stain on human history. The beginning of the plague. Our story begins in the year 1347. It was a time when trade routes connected Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, bringing exotic goods, new ideas, and a silent killer. In October of that year, a fleet of ships arrived in Sicily from the Black Sea, carrying what seemed like ordinary cargo, grains, spices, and fabrics. But on board were not only merchants and sailors, there were rats, and on those rats were tiny creatures that carried death, infected fleas. Within days, people along the Sicilian ports began to fall sick with strange and horrifying symptoms. Their bodies were gripped with agonizing pain, and large black boils filled with blood and pus erupted on their skin. Fever and chills racked their bodies, followed by vomiting, diarrhea, and eventually the terrifying black spots that would give this plague its infamous name. The deadly spread. The disease didn't stay in Sicily. Merchants and traders, unknowingly infected, carried the plague with them into mainland Europe. Soon, the death toll began to rise in Italy, France, and beyond. The plague spread with ruthless efficiency, passing from person to person, city to city, without mercy. Within weeks, it was clear that this wasn't an ordinary sickness. The symptoms were brutal and unforgiving. Those infected would experience sudden fever, chills, and agonizing pain as their bodies turned on themselves. Swollen lymph nodes, or buboes, would appear in the neck, armpits, and groin, blackened and throbbing with pain. People were dying within days, sometimes even within hours. And once someone caught the plague, their chance of survival was slim to none. The Black Death wasn't just a disease, it was a terror that brought societies to their knees. People were desperate to understand what was happening. Science was primitive and medicine was mostly superstition. Some believed the plague was a punishment from God, unleashed to punish humanity for its sins. Others thought it was the work of demons or witches. Entire communities turned to religion, praying fervently and even whipping themselves in the streets to show repentance. But nothing seemed to work. As the death toll continued to rise, society descended into chaos. People began abandoning their homes, leaving behind their families, friends, and neighbors. There were reports of people fleeing from cities, only to collapse on the roadside, dead before they could escape. Corpses filled the streets, and the stench of death was everywhere. There were so many bodies that graveyards were filled to capacity, forcing people to dig mass graves. The scene was something out of a nightmare, a horrifying tableau of suffering, desperation, and death. At the time, no one knew the real cause of the plague. People didn't understand that the disease was spread by fleas that had been carried by rats. Instead, doctors and scholars blamed bad air and poisoned winds for carrying the disease. To protect themselves, people wore bizarre outfits. Long black robes and masks with long beaks filled with herbs and spices, believing that these masks would filter the deadly air. But these masks couldn't stop the plague. The plague didn't discriminate. It struck the rich and the poor, the young and the old, the powerful and the powerless. No one was safe, and the more the people feared the disease, the more it seemed to thrive. Whole villages and towns were wiped out, and entire regions were left deserted. As the plague spread through Europe, it is estimated to have killed between 75 to 200 million people, nearly half of the population in some regions. Cities became ghost towns, as fear and death dominated every corner. Without enough people to tend the fields, famine became widespread. Families were left without providers, children orphaned, and communities shattered. The plague left scars that ran deeper than any other catastrophe in history. People began to question everything, their faith, their leaders, even the very meaning of life. It was a dark time, a time of despair, when all hope seemed lost. Finally, after several years of devastation, the Black Death began to subside. Historians aren't sure why it slowed down, but some believe it was due to changes in climate, improved sanitation, and the simple fact that so many people had died that the disease ran out of hosts. But the plague left its mark. It changed the world in ways no one could have predicted. Entire social structures collapsed, labor became scarce, and the power of the church was shaken as people sought answers beyond faith. The world was never the same.